The Forest Sleeper, a short story by Grace Bolland. Part 1. We could play hide and seek? And how could that go wrong? Let me count the ways. Quincy huffed as he followed his little brother up the winding, cramped servants' stairwell that looked like it hadn't been used since before they were born. Make that before their parents had been born. This small, disused space of their grandfather's old plantation manor could do nothing but reflect times long since past, even when the metal sconces on the walls were empty of candles and the wood handrail had been polished maybe a decade ago. Disturbed motes of dust floated in their bouncing flashlight beams, swirled up by their shuffling sneakers. Quincy pulled his t-shirt collar up over his nose and mouth and breathed through it, hoping it filtered out the majority of the dust. Danny bounced on ahead, his lungs happy to work as long as there was oxygen. A crack of thunder made them both jump. Would the rain ever let up? It wasn't even hurricane season, but they still had been confined to the house because of the dangers of flash floods. He'd overheard the adults talking about it when they were downstairs. It just keeps going, Danny said, mystified, his beam cutting through the dark as they continued to climb. We've got to have passed the 3rd floor by now. Must have passed the 3rd floor, Quincy quietly corrected through his shirt. His flashlight dimmed slightly. He smacked it against his palm, and it brightened. It did seem like they'd been climbing for an awfully long time. The dust only grew thicker as they spiraled upward, bowed steps creaking and groaning under their feet. Soon the handrail came to an abrupt end, and they were confronted by a velvet rope and an elegant sign that demurely said, "Keep out. Unsafe." The house's brief life as a museum during the 1980s was showing. Nobody must have been up here since then. Quincy added another 2 decades to his calculations. Oh. Danny's shoulders slumped as he read the sign. Guess we turn around now, Quincy said cheerfully. He tugged on the hem of Danny's shirt. Come on, let's go. Danny spun around with his most pleading face on, the one he used when he just had to have that new Lego set or go to that birthday party. It was the one his parents had grown used to resisting on most occasions. It was still one that Quincy caved to. Can't we just go have a little peek? Please, just for a few minutes? Please, 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 please. Quincy's face dropped into his usual scowl. Please, Danny tried again, clasping his hands together and rocking back on his heels, blue eyes as big as soup plates in the flashlight beam. It says it's unsafe, Quincy said, somewhat helplessly, gesturing towards the sign. We might die or something up there. I don't know. Danny's eyes only widened more. Ugh, fine. Quincy rolled his eyes, and his little brother gave a little skip of happiness, ducked under the velvet rope, and shot up the remaining stairs. Hey, don't go so fast, he called after him, stepping over the low-slung rope and knocking the sign off with a clatter. It slid down several stairs and into the dark. Sighing, he stepped back over the rope and down the stairs to retrieve it. His legs felt heavy and lead-filled as he went to hang the middle sign back on the dull gold hooks. They hadn't climbed that many stairs, surely, but it felt like they'd climbed for ages. They must still have had ages to go because he could hear Danny's heavy, childish footsteps as he clomped onward without Quincy. Clamping his flashlight between his teeth, Quincy finally fit the sign back onto the hooks. Then his eye caught a gleam of silver as it swung into place. Pulling it back up, he found a small key, no longer than a hairpin and just as thin, and taped to the back of the sign. Dan, wait up for me, Quincy called as he peeled the key off the back of the sign and shoved it into his sweatshirt pocket. Maybe he could find what it belonged to. Danny was already cantering around the attic space by the time Quincy got there, beam of light bouncing across the walls like a spotlight at a concert. Danny's shadow danced with him, a monster that stretched and leapt across the sloping walls, up to the peaking ceiling, down to cling to his beat-up sneakers. Up here, the rain was a constant pounding white noise against the thin roof. A roll of thunder made the small window at the far end rattle in its frame. He couldn't quite tell how big the place was, but it felt vast and endless, as if it was just glimpses of walls, but no true perimeter. Perhaps if he approached one of these patches of wall, he'd find a portion of wood suspended in space, darkness all around, a video game that hadn't fully rendered yet. A crash pulled Quincy back from his thoughts. Danny, in his jumping around, exhilarated by the wide space and the way only a 10-year-old can be, had knocked something over. Dan! Quincy admonished reflexively. Oops, sorry. There was a scraping sound as Danny replaced whatever he'd knocked over. Quincy swung his beam around and looked more closely. Really, it was boring. The attic was bare apart from some old pieces of furniture covered with sheets that had gone gray and yellow with dust and age respectively. A tall, half-covered oval standing mirror at one end of the room caught Quincy's eye. The side that faced him was backed by peeling brown paper. With a grunt, he pulled the mirror around so it faced him, the sheets sliding off into a pile on the floor. The frame was delicate and ornate in a burnished silver color, the mirror itself blackened by age. A beam of light suddenly reflected across its surface and into his eyes. Ow! Dan, seriously! Quincy took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Green and yellow danced across his vision whether his eyes were opened or closed. Watch where you're pointing the flashlight. The beam got in my eye. Danny stopped cavorting long enough to say, Huh? Your light, he snapped. It reflected into my eyes. Now blue stars floated in the space between the green and gold blotches. Was reflected light supposed to hurt that much? It felt like someone had just stuck their thumb into his eyeball. My light isn't on. Maybe it was yours? Danny appeared at Quincy's shoulder, a small, light, blurry reflection next to a taller, darker, blurrier reflection. Quincy jammed his frames back onto his nose and the world slid back into sparkly clarity. What do you mean it wasn't yours? Of course it was. The younger boy held out his flashlight. The batteries died a few minutes ago. It must have been yours. Oh. But Quincy knew he'd been careful not to point the light directly at the mirror. He'd had it pointed at the frame when the flash hit him. Goosebumps rose on his skin as a sharp crack of thunder echoed around the attic. The chill was only from the rain, he kept telling himself. Obviously, he hadn't been as careful as he thought he'd been. Sorry, he said. You're right, it must have been me. Cool mirror, Danny said. He reached out to touch the frame and gently ran a finger over the filigree design. Feels cold. Wonder why? Could it be the cold? Quincy shivered. He zipped up his sweatshirt and yanked the hood over his head. Okay, it's been a few minutes. Let's go now. There was a crash, and Danny yelped. His flashlight had fallen to the floor, and protruding from the mirror was a silvery hand, knuckles ghostly white with the force of the grip, clenched around Danny's wrist, blackened fingers digging into the younger boy's skin. Quincy froze, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, with a yank from the disembodied hand, Danny stumbled forward and into the mirror, the surface sucking him into its endless depths. Dan! Quincy screamed as he dived forward and just caught his little brother's ankle before it disappeared. It was like trying to pull a statue over. Quincy braced his feet and held on. Sweat was loosening his grip. Dan! Danny, I've got you! He yelled, desperately clawing at his brother's jeans for better grip. Squeezing his eyes shut, Quincy gave one mighty heave. He toppled backwards and opened them just in time to watch his brother's white-socked foot disappear into the mirror, the surface rippling like settling water. No! Quincy rocketed to his feet, one of Danny's shoes in his hand. No! He rushed the mirror head-on and slammed into it, ricocheting off and back to the floor. His face and backside stung. The mirror rocked on its lion paws, but settled upright. Quincy crawled back towards it and pounded the heel of his hand against the suddenly solid glass. Give him back! He punctuated every word with another attack on the mirror. Give him back now! But nothing happened. Quincy lunged for Danny's dropped flashlight and began striking the glass again and again with the end of the light. After 2 hits, the bulb went out, but Quincy continued to use it. You stupid mirror! He screamed. If you don't give him back right now, I swear! A splintering sound pierced the air as a jagged crack appeared down the entire length of the mirror. He stopped and stared as another suddenly crossed over the first one. Then another, until the surface had split into dozens of pieces, fracturing his reflection to disjointed shards of pale face, dark hair, and thick black shadows that crowded up to him. Quincy threw his arms over his face right before the glittering shards exploded outward, as fierce and destructive as a car crash, the pieces hitting the wood floor almost musically. When it stopped, the sharpened snowfall of tinkling still rattling around his brain, Quincy warily put his arms down and looked. Where the blackened mirror had been was a door in exactly the same shape. It fit into the frame a little unsteadily, like it had been pinched and pushed into place there, and would at any moment burst out with a bang. Quincy stood on shaking legs, glass falling off his pants and shoulders, and approached the mirror-now door. His trembling hand pressed against the wood, which felt warm and pocked and unaccountably real, something cold pressed against his palm. When Quincy peeled his hand off and looked closer, he found an impossibly tiny keyhole, just the perfect size for an impossibly tiny key. It was still in his pocket. Quincy took out the key and carefully slid it into the lock and twisted. The click was louder than such a small key should have made, and the door gently swung inward into a foggy white nothingness. Quincy stepped around the side and looked at the brown paper backing. He waved his hand behind it. Nothing could explain the fact that the mirror had opened into somewhere else. Everything in him told him not to go in, but there was a possibility that Danny was somewhere on the other side of the nothing. He couldn't just leave him there. So he put one leg over the side of the frame and fell, smacking himself against the side of the frame and giving an undignified yell inside. We hope you have enjoyed part 1 of The Forest Sleeper, a short story by Grace Bolland, read for you by the author. The rest of the story and more will be published in a short story collection by Grace Bolland, expected availability on Amazon.com in August 2018. The music used for this recording is Traveling Between the Ancient Empires by Magna Ingress, available on freemusicarchive.org. This has been a Modern Unicorn recording.